Okay, so we're going to take a look at the Chaco War here. This is largely because of what I did recently, the Triple Alliance War. This is a war in the between the war era, between World War I and World War II, between Paraguay and Bolivia. And it, shows some of the modern techniques in a pre-World War II basis, for the same reason that some people want to look at something like the Spanish Revolution. This allows you to see some of that World War II type technology, or late World War I, if you wish. This is in the 30s, so the planes and the tanks are better than they were at the end of the World War I, but the military techniques haven't been perfected the way they would be later during World War II. This war starts out in kind of a crazy fashion. Basically, both Bolivia and Paraguay were probably itching for a fight. But over here, let me see, at Boca, there's a little lake there. That blue dot indicates a water source, because this is largely fought in the Chaco, and the Chaco is not a good place to fight. You can see it's marked bush. It's basically very heavy underbrush, but with desert-like conditions in the summer where the water's really bad. There's very little water around. That's going to be the main supply constraint on these armies. And there aren't tremendous transport capabilities here. Unlike the Triple Alliance War, we're not going to see the supply lines being so, draconian. In that game, basically, supply, you had to follow a certain track. Here, you have motorized transport. We got little truck units here. You have a number of other facets that allow forces to fight here, but these are not wealthy countries with modern armies and fully modern supply capabilities. And neither was Germany at the beginning or throughout World War II, really. They were relying on horse-drawn carriages at certain times during the war. And certainly Russia as well. Anyway, moving back to this, the war started off with the Bolivians basically stumbling into a Paraguayan base and reporting it back, and through political machinations, the existence of that base was not reported. They were told to claim the territory because the border line was disputed and not fully formed at that point. And the Paraguayans were more than happy to have an excuse to start a war over this. They were close to their supply lines. They were well prepared for a fight. They're a much smaller country, so their overall reserves are less, and you would think, this actually starts in 32, that a 4-year war would favor the larger country. But the truth of the matter is that Paraguay's nearness to their supply heads allowed them to actually win the war, more or less, along with other things like poor leadership on Bolivia's part and some other factors. Anyway, so this is an interesting situation, one where the weaker seeming force on paper is going to win the war. And well, let's take a look at some of the roles now. Well, we'll look at the components first. I do want to apologize. I've been kind of I've been really slow in gaming recently. As personal decisions, I'm playing a video game because I'm transitioning to work very shortly. I should have been starting at the beginning of this week. Should start now at the beginning of next week, but both of those seem to be delayed because of screw-ups of various nature, not mine. Anyway, I'm thankful to have the extra time, but I've been playing video games instead, and that means almost no board gaming, and I'm trying to get something out. Taking a look at the pieces, we have pretty standard, those are headquarters, those probably aren't the best choice. Pretty standard combat units. You can see the numbers there are attack, defense, movement. This is just unit designation, and then above is also unit designation. Some units had names as well as numbers, some have just one or just the other. For headquarters, things are a little bit different. We have 3 numbers: political rating, which is going to be how hard it is to remove a leader; the command rating, which is going to be how good they are in combat, as well as generating supplies and such not. And then the final number is the movement allowance. And remember, my zoom seems to be holding right there. Amazing. We have a marker to indicate who the overall commander of the army in the area is. Some tracks to keep track of victory points for each nation and replacement point units. Some truck counters, which have 2 sides. The other side is a dedicated side, which is meaning that it's going to be providing a supply radius instead of transporting units. Air markers, which flip over, are used. The Bolivians have a larger air force. They also are the only side with armor. Now, there's some concepts in this game that are a little different. The presentation of the rules is a little different than I'm used to. It appears largely okay, but I'm having trouble with it because I'm not used to facing it. So, you know, I've only looked at one other Command Magazine game before. Let's see what else we have. On the map itself, interesting features that we need to deal with. Like I said, the water's an issue here, so that's going to be specifically covered. And in fact, Paraguay engineers can build wells to extend the supply of water. The Bolivians didn't understand how to dig. Seriously, the Paraguayans made special units to deal in the Chaco digging wells. Even though more of the Chaco's in Bolivian territory, they didn't bother. These entrenchment markers, I'm not sure, spaces, I'm not sure what they are. They may be indications of where an entrenchment is likely to be. These markers are entrenchments and fortifications, and I don't know if the on-map stuff is just an indication of where those tended to be, or if those have an actual effect. And that's kind of troubling, and something I'm going to have to figure out as I go on. Basically, whether those are permanent or not is my question. In the setup, for example, I was told to put an entrenchment marker there, and the fortification is the ×3 side of that. These are an interesting option. Engineers can clear the brush. Now, they're just building trails, but it works effectively as though the entire brush space is no longer there. Kind of a reminder of actions that were taken in a game I recently did, Blood Tree Rebellion up there, which you should definitely watch if you're at all interested in counterinsurgency handled in detail or science fiction type stuff. But it's more interesting as a counterinsurgency. I think a lot of games have taken ideas from that one. Anything else here that I need to cope with? No. All right. Let's try to work our way through the rules. We're not going to go into too much depth, I hope, although I don't really have a great grasp of them. You'll notice another thing. I don't have my metal cup here. Why? Well, I'm clipping counters into it, and I wanted to use this instead because I'm clipping something large. Okay. Hexes are controlled by moving through them. Let me see if there's anything else here. Oh, we haven't gone into supply units. So supply units, this is kind of clever. We have these little markers. This is how many supply units times 3. Okay. On the back side of all of them, though, it's just a single supply unit. And I think countermix matters with those, that you can't overproduce supply. Countermix matters on a lot of things, but not everything. It matters on trucks, matters on depots. These, both players share those, actually. Okay. And unused units are going to be put in a pile, in a reinforcement pile. You got no idea what you're going to get. So in the case of Bolivians, the armor's in there too. The engineers are in there for both sides. All kind of stuff like that. You're allowed 5 leaders on the board at a time in the game. And some of those leaders are unnamed leaders, like this guy. But the named leaders have more effect. And those leaders are going to be vital to your being able to pursue combat operations. They not only, they essentially throw supply, but they also are necessary for you to actually fight. You need to have a leader involved to engage in combat. So they become very important. However, it's not a very big map, so 5 leaders probably will allow you to make the combats you want to. This isn't going to be a continuous front game, I don't think. We have off-board unit boxes, and I'm only really using one where the pile's big. They're not very big off-board unit boxes, so they don't really help in terms of reducing stack size in the way some do. And then there's this, which is going to be the supply radius. Depending on the effectiveness of your commander-in-chief, the average supply radius is, and also weather and some other things, is 6, but it could be modified to 8 or 4. And those counters, one counter allows you to have 3 values by that, which I think is clever. Okay. Quick look at the sequence of play, what you're going to be doing. Checking supply, drawing your units, then you move, then your enemy gets a reaction move, then you fight, then your enemy gets a reaction fight, then you're allowed to attack again, and then you can build things and you go to a political phase. And it's symmetrical in the sense that other than checking for weather and the truce, everything is kind of linked to the player turn. So we had some problems, I think, in the Paraguayan one, the Triple Alliance War, where the sequence of play wasn't symmetrical, which meant one side had to worry about supply more than the other, or something. I don't remember quite what the situation. I think it was supply. Anyway, one side had something that they, or victory, I don't know. One side had something that they had a real advantage for. Zones of control in this. You can't enter one without a leader. If you're in a zone of control, you don't get to do reaction movement. They don't force attacks. They do prevent retreats, routes. They affect supply, although they can be negated by friendly units. And you can advance through a zone of control and an advance after combat. You can advance without worrying about the zones of control that you're in. You can leave them, but you can't move from one to the other. Pretty standard stuff. So there's 2 kinds of supply in the game: general supply and combat supply. And this is kind of an interesting dualism, or whatever. Not, it shouldn't be, but 2 ways of handling this. As I stretch for some kind of words, I'm wondering what that gap there is. Oh, I know what I'm clipping. Okay. That a game like the OCS doesn't really handle very well. So the OCS, you transport supply and it's just generic stuff, right? And you can use it for artillery, you can use it for small arms fire, you can use it to feed your troops. It's just all stuff. And that works fine, but in this game instead what they've decided is, that stuff that you're feeding units, that's significantly different from the combat supplies that you're moving forward. And the stuff that you're feeding units, largely you just have to build up a supply line. And the way you build up a supply line is you build a chain of different supply units. And and that includes headquarters and other things. We'll get to that in a moment. The other is these supply unit markers, which have to be expended for actual combat activities. Okay, so the supply line itself. Now, unfortunately, the charts and tables are printed on a page of the rules. I probably should photocopy this. This is going to be based on this supply table where you count how many hexes you go from, and this is kind of like the Zucker games in terms of operations points. How many hexes from your off-map supply space out to your general headquarters. And we have GHQs. We have one here. Each army has one GHQ to handle the overall operations. So the GHQ is then going to become your center of supply. And the further out you are, the less combat supply you're going to get and the less replacement points and trucks you're going to get. And what you do is you count those hexes, you roll a die, and you modify it by the Army Commander's command rating. So in this case, we'd look for Peña, not Peñar. I gotta make sure that's right. Peña and his command rating, which I believe is the first number. No, the second number. So he'd give no modification there. If he's not with his GHQ, there's modifiers for various things there, but that's going to give you an amount of supply points, which will be these counters, and of replacement points on your track. The way replacement points work is you'll be able to spend them to unflip units, as it were. And then any new trucks that come on at the same time, and you're limited by your counter mix and trucks. I know that. I'm not sure about. I think supply points you may not be. Okay. Now, let's see what else. So to get general supply, you trace from a supply source along a line of communications to the Army's general headquarters, and then from there you're going to have to trace lines equal to the maximum supply radius or less between that and headquarters units, and I believe depots. Now, let's see. Now you can also draw supply from the home supply sources directly. But out of the GHQ, you'd trace it from headquarters to headquarters, basically. So you just have to form a link of those. Now, that can be extended by using these depot markers in case your headquarters get too far out in front of your GHQ. Where's the railhead? The railhead's here. That serves as a supply source as marked, as long as it's not unconnected. I'm looking to see if the rivers are working as such. They don't appear to be. Okay. And as long as you can connect those things, you get you're in general supply, and you're not going to have to roll an attrition roll. If you're not in general supply, you're going to have to take attrition, and that will be this table over here, where you get further penalties for not having water, for being isolated, where you can't even trace out to any supply source. But you can get a bonus. The Bolivians once per turn can use one air unit per turn to air supply and basically drop some additional food and water into a hex. Okay. Now, how do you have no water? You have water if you're on a wet settlement or a well, or if you're adjacent to a river, or if it's rainy season. You can see we've got rainy season up there. Otherwise, if you get cut off from your normal supply and the trucks aren't bringing you water, you've got bigger problems. Now, this supply setup doesn't really tax your network the way, say, the OCS or Desert Fox's supply system does. And that may be a little bit too friendly. What about those trucks? Well, those trucks can be attached to a hex from which a supply radius is projected. So, for example, a headquarters or whatever. And what that does is it allows the radius of the distance to be taken using mechanized movement points instead of non-mechanized. You can choose one or the other when you have an attached truck. So it allows you to extend along the roadways. If you look, mechanized movement is good on the roads, but it sucks in just about anything else. So the question is, well, you know, trucks will help you move from the general headquarters out along a road network, but they're not going to really help you right in the combat situation. There aren't enough roads for that to make sense, except maybe right around here or whatever. Now that's if a truck's flipped over to the attached side. If it's not flipped over, it's allowed to transport units and or combat supply points using its movement point allowance and mechanizing the movement, which can allow you to shift stuff up more quickly. All right, what about those combat supply points? Well, you burn them in order to conduct combat. And if you don't burn them, you don't fight at full effectiveness. Supply units can move on their own. They have 4 movement points, and they move as non-mechanized units unless you load them on a truck. All right, we're going to take a little break here. Okay. Units come either from a replacement schedule, which comes off the supply table, and you'll just build up replacement points. You're not allowed to go over 9. They're to unflip units. They have to be in supply, la la la. And then a reinforcement schedule where the Bolivians start out getting few units and then start getting more and more, they start getting 3 per turn after the first turn of the game. Paraguay goes for a while getting 3 per turn, but then they get cut back. And those are just going to be draws from this cup. When this cup is empty, anything in the dead pile moves into the cup. It's supposed to be over here, but I figured drawing from a cup is going to be easier than randomizing out of one of those. And that keeps happening. The one exception that I can find is that armor units are never replaced. If they end up coming on board and getting killed, they're gone for good. And I don't know if they have 2 steps. They do not. But everything else is pretty much replaceable. And you don't know what you're going to get. You could get artillery, you could get engineers, you could get whatever. You don't know what the political government, the civilian leaders are going to actually send you, what they have available. You're allowed to spend victory points for a call-up. And that gets you additional units, a die roll of units. Now, Paraguay is only allowed to do this twice per game. But Bolivia, because of their huge population comparatively, they have like 3 times the population, can do it as many times as they like. But there's a cost each time you do it in victory points, and victory points are how you win the game. We'll look at those. There's some interesting ideas with the victory points in this game. They're kind of randomized, what happens. Movement, nothing too exciting here. Non-combat units, when they get overrun, there are special rules for each of them. The terrain is covered here. Unfortunately, again, not the most useful charts and tables division I've seen. They use the space for the tracks and the special counters that maybe I think would have been better used for the charts on the board. Now, obviously, I would rather have a player aid or a sheet of paper that I could remove. I'll probably end up photocopying this so that I have that, because this is going to be very difficult to cope with, or maybe not. But I don't think there's anything too exciting here. Trucks can carry 1 unit or 2 combat supply points. You can't move tanks. It costs to pick things up. I think you're allowed to ferry things. I think the movement, I'm not positive, but I think it's fairly flexible in this. Just to say, stacking doesn't really matter during movement, so it really doesn't matter how flexible the movement system is. In some games there's overruns. There aren't in here. There's off-map boxes, which have costs listed on them in either movement points or number of turns that they take, depending on if they're just short road junkets or large transit areas that you would be able to move through. Stacking is based on the terrain. It's 6 in a clear hex, or a hex with entrenchment or fortifications, and no more than 4 in any other type of hex. Okay. Combat's voluntary. Adjacent. So I'm checking what the supply marker. I believe if you expend a supply marker, it works for everything in range of it, but I'm not positive of that. I'm looking for that somewhere. All right, let's take a look at the combat results. So the combat results in this, in a kind of GDW type of way, you determine the odds and you get percentage losses that you're taking of your force. So it's not really a firepower table, it's just what percentage of your force that you lose. And you get an R result on some of the cases, and that means you roll then on this retreat route marker. And whoever the leader with the greatest political rating gives his command rating as a modifier to this. And that's going to determine whether you take a retreat or a route. A retreat just pushes you back a couple hexes. You see the effects here. I'm looking what a route does. Routing combat moves back their full movement allowance, paying all terrain costs, and if they fail, they take a step loss from that. And the retreating units also, if they fail, they take, if they can't retreat into a zone of control or whatever, they take step loss for that. If you end up in a hex where you're going to have to fight, or where there's a combat planned for it, you can't add your forces to the combat, but you end up suffering any results. Standard stuff. Okay, combat supply. So we've already talked about your strength is halved if you don't have combat supply. You have to be stacked with a combat supply point to have supply, or within a supply radius of a leader that's stacked with a combat supply point. And the combat supply point will be expended. Each combat requires a different combat supply point. So they kind of get around it. If you fight, you got to spend a point or not. You know, your choice. But the terrain, I think, is pretty self-explanatory here. Just, you know, modifiers, the rivers, is if all units are attacking across the river, engineers can affect this kind of stuff. All pretty simple there. Okay. Special units, the armor, artillery, aircraft, engineers, and we'll talk about leaders too. If armor is present and the defenders take a retreat result, and the defenders in clear terrain, largely without fortifications or entrenchment, they get a penalty on their route retreat die roll. That's all it does, and it's mechanized movement. Artillery barrages, okay. Both sides, and this is one thing that I never really understood in some games. I mentioned this before in the Triple Alliance one. Some games seem to give artillery a bonus on the attack and no bonus on the defense. And my thinking there was, okay, that does not make sense in that time period. Artillery was very powerful on the defense in that time period. Maybe it's just kind of the softening up a fortified position or whatever. But, you know, by the time you get to Vietnam, certainly artillery is very useful on defense. And honestly, it was pretty useful in World War II. It's only in World War I that I kind of can see giving a lower defense strength to artillery, with the idea that, yes, the field guns would be fine, but some of the heavier artillery there. And you'll have that in certain areas as well. But artillery should provide a defensive fire bonus. And depending on how abstracted the game is, and this one's fairly abstract, you should see that. Now, in that game, for some reason, they give the artillery a defensive value of 1, basically. In this, artillery can be used fairly normally. If you take a look at them, they have a weak defensive strength, but if they fire, they can do the artillery barrage, which I think that covers the situation correctly, which is, okay, if you don't commit the artillery to fire in a combat in this barrage type fashion, yes, it's not going to have as strong a value as it would normally. So the way this is going to happen is you do the barrages before normal combat. First the attacker, then the defender. You total the eligible artillery units, with reduced units counted as a half. That'll barrage in the same hex. And there's going to be a barrage table here, which you see how many steps you do to the defending forces. The owner gets to allocate the losses. You need a leader present, just like a regular combat for a barrage, and the barraging units each expend 1 combat strength point. So again, like in the OCS games, actually using your artillery the way it's meant to be used is very expensive in terms of your combat supply. So you may find it's difficult to have the supplies necessary to use your artillery effectively. Aircraft, on the other hand, and of course artillery can be used on attack without that barrage factor, just using their points, which means you have some capability for it. It's just if you do a massive barrage to just try to soften the enemy position, that's going to cost you a lot of ammo. The air markers can each be used once, and they provide ground support during combat. After the odds have been determined, the attacker and defender each can allocate 1 air unit, and that'll change the odds. That'll change the combat die roll results by 1 in your favor, and they can cancel out. Engineers have a number of uses in this one. For one thing, they can build entrenchments, fortifications, wells, and trails. If they're next to rivers, they can help you cross at a reduced movement point rate, which is listed on the terrain effects table. If you want to use an engineer to build something, let's see if I can find an engineer. There are more Paraguayan engineers. There's one. You flip it over to its construction side to indicate that it can't move. It can participate in combat, but if it does so, it loses its construction side. And if it's on its building side, in the construction phase of the player turn, it completes whatever it tried to do. So it basically just takes your player turn. You don't have to be constructing for multiple turns or anything. To build entrenchments, you can build it in any type of terrain except marsh. The entrenchments will double the combat strength points of any units that occupy the hex. They're permanent and can be used by either side. This is what's iffy to me, again, about these entrenchment and fortification markers, spaces on the map. It looks to me like the fact that, see, there were forts here. That's what troubles me, as I don't know why there's an instruction to put one there. I would have assumed that those are just permanent forts if there wasn't an instruction to put it there. So I'm troubled by that. But other than that, I had thought that those were permanent entrenchments already on the place. Fortifications, you upgrade an entrenchment, and it goes up to a ×3. Trails, one of the things you can do is you can clear a brush hex, and it stops being a brush hex. You're not clearing the whole hex, but it's effectively has that factor. Now, there's an important thing here where there's hex sides. This is kind of a weird idea in the game. Those hex sides, this makes this a clear terrain attack. So it's almost like the kind of solution that was done in... Looking. Der Weltkrieg, the SPW games, where hexside terrain becomes more important. Now here it just is this weird kind of trumping, and I think it's more attractive than those funny like pizza pies all over the map, which cause really ugly geometrics to the maps in terms of the terrain. This solves the problem. Maybe a little heavier rules overhead to describe what's going on, but I doubt it. This doesn't take up a lot of space here. What else do we have? The Paraguayans can try to dig wells. They do a building attempt to dig a well, and if they get a 1, 2, or 3, they get a well. Otherwise, they don't. The wells can be destroyed by moving through them, and this is important because there are only 2 wells in the game allowed, and you may not control the well after you dig it, which means the Bolivians, if they take the well, will probably not destroy it simply because they don't want you digging more wells. I'm not sure what that's supposed to represent, but anyway. Okay, what about your commanders? All right. So in your political phase, you're allowed to try to replace one of your leaders. You may be forced to try to replace one of your leaders. The army commander must be replaced if that leader's command rating was used in combat and his side suffered at least a 50 or an E result. Then the commander will be flipped to its question mark side. What you'll see is these commanders... I'm sorry. This has a question mark, which indicates that there's going to be a possible replacement. And if one of the subordinates has a greater political rating, if there are several subordinates with higher political rating, you use the one that's highest, and that'll be the challenger. Now this is done the same way if you do it voluntarily, but except that you get to pick who the challenger is. The owning player rolls a die. You add the difference between the army commander's political rating and that of the challenger. You add 1 for each additional subordinate who has a political rating greater than the army commander's. And the player may also add or subtract 1 to the die roll result at his wish by spending 5 victory points, political capital, for trying to maintain or remove the guy, for each point that you want to add or subtract. You can only spend 15 victory points on any given attempt. If you roll at least twice the army commander's political rating, he's replaced. He goes in the replaced leader's box, and I believe doesn't come back. And the challenging subordinate is the new army commander. You draw a new leader counter at random, who could be one of these ABC0 markers, as the subordinate replacement. If the result's greater than but less than twice the army commander's political rating, he survives the challenge and there's no effect. If the result is equal, The challenging subordinate is put in the replace leader's box, and the owning player gets a new leader. If the result is less, then the challenging commander is put in the replace leader box, a new leader is drawn from the available leader. Sounds like the same thing. Okay. That was just an error. Voluntarily replacing, you can do it the same way. You indicate any subordinates who are supporting removing the leader. These subordinates have to have a higher political rating than the army commanders. If the results at least twice, okay, the results I believe are the same, except that if you fail, you take a victory point penalty. If the replacement just fails normally, the victory point total is reduced by the army commander's political rating plus the die roll. If the result is less than the army commander's political rating, the replacement fails and the owning player's victory point rating total is reduced by the army commander's political rating plus twice a die roll. You can also try to replace a subordinate, but you can't replace one whose political rating is greater than the army commander's. You roll a die. You can add 1 for 2 victory points up to a maximum of 6 victory points spent. If the result is greater than the leader's political rating, he's put in the replace leader's box and a new leader is drawn from the available box. If the die roll is equal to or less than the leader's political rating, the replacement attempt fails, and you take a victory point loss equal to the political rating of the guy you just tried to replace. When the available leaders is exhausted, all the replaced leaders go back in the available leader box, which is the same as the reinforcements work. Unnamed leaders can only be subordinates. If you draw one for army commander somehow, draw another leader counter. I don't think that can happen. If a leader is stepped on, he just falls back and costs you some victory points equal to, based on his political value. Okay. So what about the victory conditions? This is going to be based on victory points. At the end of... Okay. The player with the most victory points, right. At the end of a truce turn, if one player has 50 or more victory points above the opponent, he wins the game. It also will be determined by a straight victory point comparison at the end of the game, if you reach that far. Players add and subtract victory points for various things. Eliminated combat units are worth a point. If they surrender due to isolation, they're worth 2 points. Captured enemy combat strength points are worth a point each. A point per strength. I'm sorry. Captured combat supply points are worth a point each. Sorry about that. Enemy-controlled settlements are going to be worth points. Now, if it's Villamontes, Charaga, Isla Poix, and Nanawa, it's going to be this. I don't know where they all are. That's Nanawa. I'll have to find those out during play. But there's a set of them. You roll 2 dice. When you capture it, you get that many victory points for doing so. If you capture other settlements, you roll 1 die. I'm sorry, roll 2 dice and add the result. Okay. You roll 1 die, double it, and add the results to the victory point total. Hold on. Okay, no. So if you capture it in advance after combat, you get 1 die or 2 dice for those special ones. If you capture it during movement, i.e. it's just been abandoned, you get double the results added to your victory point totals. If you exit combat units off the enemy's map edge, you get 1 victory point per, and I guess they go into your replacements. I don't know. Each time you call up reinforcements, you lose 5. Leader displacements are going to cost you a die roll times the political rating. That's if you get stepped on. Victory points expended to modify a leader replacement attempt die rolls are spent. Failed leader replacements. And then we have how good a victory it is. And it has to be 20 points to get you above marginal. If somebody goes to negative victory points somehow, and everybody starts with them, Paraguay starts with 15 at the lower amount, Bolivia 20, then you lose the game. And I think you're expected to kill yourself. I'm not sure. So, some players, they recognize, will not like the randomness of the political, the victory points for capturing territory. So instead they set fixed values that are actually a little higher. So you get more victory points, makes it less likely that you will surrender, I guess. Makes territory more important. I'm not sure what the point is. But the reason that they're randomized in the base game is that political decisions outside the player's control often decided that a territory was more important than it should have been strategically. So you wouldn't really know how the press, how the populace would react to a fall of a certain area and such not. And that's of some importance. And then we have a number of different scenarios. They suggest doing just this Bokran offensive, the initial offensive, the first couple times to get a feel for the game. I'm going to play the full campaign, figure I'll make blunders, but historically there were a lot of blunders in this war. So I'm hoping that that won't cause too much trouble. But they give you a significant number of smaller scenarios you can play. Honestly, this is from what I can see of it, this is a pretty damn rich magazine game. Other than the little component issue of there not being a player aid for this, I'm pretty damn impressed with what I see in terms of everything. One thing I want to complain about, though, I like to complain about things no matter what, is there's a bunch of counters from other games included in this counter sheet. And I could not find any indication of where they go. I'm sure in some other command magazine, they probably tell you what game those should be added to. They weren't on the counter sheet. I clipped it myself. I would have kept something that indicated that, I think. They aren't in the rules, and I cannot find them in the magazine either. That's, to me, a little crappy. Are these necessary to other games? Maybe not. One of them looks like it's from a game that I have, the Aztecs. That might be this one. It looks similar. And I may have this one as well. But, you know, if you don't have a subscription, you don't know where these counters are supposed to go to. So, personally, I think if you're going to add these kind of counters, which probably are just vanity counters, small replacements that you could have fixed, you know, with a little bit of ink, but they had extra counter sheet spaces on it. So unlike, you know, the old S&Ts, they often had mistakes, and maybe you'd be told about them later. But when I get the counters, I feel like I'm missing something because I don't know where they're supposed to go. And that just kind of makes it worse than actually never having those counters. And maybe getting the magazine where they tell me, oh yeah, you should change this one. I don't know. And maybe I have counters for this magazine game somewhere else. Who knows? Anyway, that's a look at the rules. Yes, kind of meandering and not very well done as usual, but I'm hoping to get this starting to play today, but like I said, I'm kind of slow on the playing right now. Up it goes.